At her father's funeral, Clara Bellamy learned that grief could be interrupted by arithmetic. The last mourners had scarcely left the drawing room when her uncle Roland placed a folded account upon the table beside the untouched seed cake. Rain tapped the windows of Bellamy House, and damp black coats had left dark marks across the carpet. Her father's chair stood empty near the fire. "You may remain until Monday," Roland said. "After that, the household will be reduced." Clara looked from the account to her uncle. "This is my home. It was your father's home, and your father died owing the family £340. The figure was written in Roland's precise hand. Beneath it appeared charges for physicians, repairs, advances, and interest. Clara recognized several amounts, but others had no dates or receipts. "My father kept records of every debt. Then perhaps he should have kept better ones." Roland's wife lowered her eyes. Their solicitor, Mr. Vane, continued arranging papers as if Clara were not sitting 3 feet away. For 11 years, Clara had copied estate plans for her father, calculated roof pitches, and accompanied him when failing eyesight made surveying difficult. Edmund Bellamy had taught her to test every measurement twice and every claim 3 times. Yet because she was his unmarried daughter rather than his son, none of that work had given her a place in his will. Bellamy House had passed to Roland under the settlement written before Clara's birth. Only one property stood outside it. Mr. Vane unfolded a second document. "Your maternal grandmother left your mother a life interest in the cottage at Bellwether Head. Upon Mrs. Bellamy's death, that interest passed to her eldest surviving child. My mother had only me." "Precisely." Roland's mouth tightened. "It is no inheritance worth celebrating. The cottage adjoins an abandoned lighthouse. The roof leaks, the western chimney is unsafe, and 3 years of parish rates remain unpaid. The road is impassable at spring tides. How much is owed? £11, 8 shillings. Clara possessed £17 in her savings box. Roland leaned toward her. "Sign the cottage over to me, and I will discharge the rates. I shall also permit you 6 months' lodging with Aunt Lydia in Bath." Permit. The word struck more sharply than his accusation about her father. "And if I refuse?" "You may take possession of the place and its obligations. But you cannot remain here." Clara examined the transfer deed. Roland had prepared it before the funeral. Her father's brass measuring compass rested in her pocket. She had found it beside his bed on the morning he died, folded inside the linen handkerchief embroidered by her mother. It was not valuable, but its familiar weight steadied her. "Why do you want a worthless cottage?" Roland's fingers paused on the table. "To spare you embarrassment." "That was not my question." Mr. Vane glanced toward the door. "Miss Bellamy, your uncle's proposal is practical. So was preparing this deed before my father was buried." A flush climbed Roland's neck. "Your stubbornness will not make you competent to live alone on a cliff." Clara took up the pen. For one terrible moment, she imagined Bath, a narrow room in Aunt Lydia's house, gratitude demanded for every meal, her drawings locked away because they were unsuitable work for a lady. Then she set the pen beside the unsigned transfer. "I will take the cottage." By Monday morning, her trunks had been reduced to 2. Roland claimed that the drafting table, instruments, and most of her father's books belonged to the estate. Clara was allowed her clothing, the measuring compass, a boxwood rule, 3 pencils, and a portfolio containing drawings she could prove were hers. The coach carried her west through 2 days of rain. At Penrith, she hired a farmer's cart for the final 6 miles. The driver would go no farther than the tidal causeway. Bellwether Head rose beyond it, black against a bruised evening sky. The lighthouse tower stood unlit above the cliffs, its lantern glass clouded with salt. Crouched beneath it was the keeper's cottage, one roof slope patched with rusted tin, the other bowed like a tired back. Clara crossed before the tide covered the stones. The front door resisted until she drove her shoulder against it. Inside, The air smelled of wet plaster, soot, and something bitterly mineral. Water ticked into a basin left by some former occupant. She lit a candle and began with the habit her father had given her: observe before judging. The kitchen wall leaned but had not separated. The eastern floor remained sound. 2 rooms might be made habitable if she sealed the broken windows. It was ruinous, certainly, but not hopeless. In the former keeper's room, Clara paced the width, then checked it with her boxwood rule. 15 feet, 4 inches. She went outside into the rain and measured the same span along the northern wall. 19 feet, 9 inches. Clara measured again. More than 4 feet of the cottage had vanished between the exterior stone and the interior plaster. There was no door, chimney, or stair to explain it. Only a thick wall papered in faded blue stripes. As she pressed her palm against it, carriage lamps appeared on the causeway. A gentleman stepped down beneath a black umbrella. He did not introduce himself before looking past Clara at the cottage. "I represent Sir Alistair Wycliffe," he said. "He is prepared to purchase this property tonight." Clara kept one hand against the impossible wall. Then Sir Alistair has chosen a curious time to value something everyone insists is worthless. The gentleman withdrew a leather case from inside his coat. "My name is Gideon Pike. I manage the Wycliffe estate." He offered Clara a document sheltered beneath the umbrella. "Sir Alistair will pay £25 and assume the unpaid rates. Given the condition of the cottage, the terms are charitable." Clara did not take it. £25 would purchase a year of modest lodging, perhaps 2 if she found copying work. It would also leave her dependent upon strangers once the money was gone. "Has Sir Alistair inspected the property?" "He knows Bellwether Head better than anyone." "Then he knows the northern wall is nearly 20 feet wide." Pike's expression remained composed, but his eyes shifted toward the keeper's room. "The place has been altered many times. You will find nothing behind rotten plaster except vermin. I did not say anything was behind it." Rain hissed against the lantern glass. Pike closed the case. "Young women alone are not treated gently by this coast, Miss Bellamy. The nearest mason will not come cheaply, and no insurer will cover that roof. The offer expires tomorrow. Then tomorrow it will expire." His politeness hardened by a degree. Sir Alistair dislikes unresolved boundaries. He returned to the carriage. Clara watched its lamps retreat across the causeway until the rising tide swallowed the road behind it. During the night, the western roof began to leak in 6 places. Clara moved the basin beneath the worst drip and placed cooking pots beneath the others. Wind entered through a broken pane in the kitchen, flattening her candle flame and driving rain across the floor. She blocked the opening with a folded blanket, then discovered that the fireplace smoked whenever the outer door was closed. By midnight, her dress was damp, her hands were black with soot, and the cottage remained bitterly cold. She slept in a chair with her father's portfolio across her knees. At first light, she assessed her position. The bread in her traveling bag would last 1 day. She had no dry fuel, no safe chimney, and only £5 12 shillings after paying the carter, coach fare, and a half-year installment toward the parish rates. She could not investigate the wall until she had made 1 room fit to survive in. The tide withdrew shortly after 8. Carrying a list of necessities, Clara crossed the causeway and followed the cliff road to the village of Penrooth. Conversation stopped when she entered the general shop. The proprietor, Mr. Curnow, stood behind a counter crowded with candles, nails, lamp oil, and jars of tea. 2 fishermen near the stove studied Clara with open curiosity. "I require window glass, roofing felt, a bag of coal, and delivery to Bellwether Head," she said. Mr. Curnow rubbed his thumb along the edge of his ledger. "Delivery there costs extra." "How much?" 7 shillings. The cottage is less than 3 miles away. Roads poor." "I walked it." A fisherman coughed to conceal a laugh. Clara reduced her order to lamp oil, candles, bread, cheese, nails, and a small roll of felt she could carry herself. When she asked where she might hire a mason, Mr. Curnow said every skilled man in Penrith was occupied on the Wycliffe estate. Outside, a girl of about 12 waited beside the shop wall. She wore a patched red shawl and held one boot above the mud where its sole had separated. "You are the Lighthouse lady," she said. "I live in the cottage. The lighthouse itself appears to belong chiefly to the gulls." The girl smiled. "I'm Nell Tressa. My grandfather kept the lamp before they shut it." "Did he live in the cottage?" "For 26 years. Clara glanced back at the shop window. Mr. Curnow was watching them. "Do you remember the keeper's room?" Nell's smile vanished. "Grandfather told us never to touch the blue wall." "Why?" "He said it listened." Before Clara could ask what he meant, a woman called sharply from across the street. Nell hurried away, her loose sole slapping against the stones. The return journey became a contest between Clara and the wind. Twice the roofing felt nearly tore from her arms. She reached the causeway as seawater began sliding over its lowest stones and crossed with her skirts gathered above her ankles. For the rest of the day she worked. She boarded the broken pane with timber removed from a collapsed cupboard, cleared the chimney blockage with a length of wire, and patched the roof from inside where she could reach the rafters. The repairs were ugly, temporary, and effective enough to keep one corner dry. At dusk, she ate bread beside a small coal fire and examined the keeper's room. The blue-striped paper had been applied over older plaster. Near the floor, salt damp had loosened a narrow flap. Clara eased it back with her rule. Beneath it lay a rectangular brass grill no larger than her hand. It had been painted over so carefully that its edges disappeared into the wall. There was no soot upon it, and no flue marked on the cottage plan filed with her grandmother's deed. Clara held the candle close. A faint current drew the flame toward the grill. The hidden space was not sealed, it was breathing. Clara lowered the candle and watched the flame straighten. The draft was weak but steady. Air entered or escaped through some passage beyond the grill, which meant the missing space had not been filled with rubble. She pressed her ear against the brass. At first she heard only wind moving around the cottage. Then came a low, hollow murmur, followed by 3 soft knocks. Clara stepped back. The sound did not repeat. She refused to name it before she understood it. Her father had often warned that fear was merely a conclusion reached before the measurements were complete. In daylight, she removed the remaining wallpaper around the grill. 4 screws held it in place, their slots clogged with paint. She cleaned one with a pin, but the corroded metal would not turn. Forcing it might destroy whatever mechanism lay behind it. Instead, she began a proper survey. Using the boxwood rule and a length of twine, Clara measured every wall, window, and corner. She drew the cottage at a scale of 1/4 inch to the foot, noting the thickness of the exterior masonry and the position of both chimneys. By noon, the discrepancy had taken shape on paper. The hidden space was not a simple room. It narrowed toward the lighthouse tower like a wedge, beginning at 4 feet 5 inches wide and ending at less than 2. The brass grill opened into its broadest section. More curious still, the keeper's room floor stood 14 inches higher than the kitchen floor, without any corresponding rise in the ground outside. Something lay beneath it. A knock sounded at the front door. Clara opened it to find Nell Tressa holding a basket covered with sacking. "Gran sent kindling," the girl said. "She says it isn't charity because we have too much." "Does your grandmother often suffer from excessive firewood?" "Only when someone needs it." Inside the basket were split branches, 2 lumps of coal, 4 potatoes, and a small crock of dripping. Clara's pride objected, but her empty cupboard overruled it. "Tell your grandmother, I will repay her." "She said you would say that." Nell entered cautiously and stared toward the blue wall. Clara noticed the girl's damaged boot. "Sit by the fire." From her luggage, she took a small awl, waxed thread, and a strip of leather cut from a broken portfolio strap. Her mother had taught her plain household mending, though repairing footwear required more determination than elegance. Clara stitched the loose sole firmly enough to survive the village road. Nell tested it against the floor. Gran paid 6 pence to have the other one done. Then we shall call the kindling and the boot equal. The arrangement pleased them both. While Nell warmed her hands, Clara showed her the floor plan. Did your grandfather ever mention a narrow chamber beside this room? Nell shook her head. He called it the listening place. Once, when I was little, I put my ear against the wall. I heard water under the house. The sea is below the cliff. Not that water. This sounded near. Clara remembered the raised floor. Did he keep any papers from his years here? Sir Alistair's men took his logbooks when the lamp closed. They said everything belonged to the Wycliffes. Did the lighthouse belong to them? Nell frowned. Grandfather said the light belonged to anyone trying to come home. It was not a legal answer, but Clara wrote it in the margin of her drawing. After Nell left, Clara turned to making the eastern room habitable. One ceiling joist had split near the outer wall, causing the plaster to sag. She could not replace it alone, but she could relieve its weight. From the collapsed cupboard, she salvaged 2 sound oak uprights and a crosspiece. She cut shallow notches with a borrowed handsaw Nell had brought from her grandmother, then raised a temporary brace beneath the damaged joist. The ceiling lifted less than half an inch, just enough to close the widening crack. By evening, the room contained a swept floor, a dry sleeping corner, and a makeshift table set beneath the unbroken window. Clara placed her father's compass beside her plans. It was one room. It was not comfort, but it was possession, made real through labor. The tide was at its lowest when the 3 knocks sounded again. This time Clara was standing over the drawing. She counted the seconds, until a 4th knock came from beneath the keeper's floor. Then a 5th, farther away. She carried her candle outside and followed the northern wall toward the lighthouse tower. At ground level, brambles concealed a line of stone, darker than the surrounding granite. Clara pulled them aside. The stones formed a shallow arch that had been sealed with pale mortar. Unlike the century-old joints around it, this mortar bore the parallel grooves of a mason's comb. Someone had closed the opening after the cottage was built. From behind it came another hollow knock, and the unmistakable rush of water moving upward beneath the floor. Clara knelt beside the sealed arch until seawater began creeping across the causeway behind her. The sound beneath the cottage intensified as the tide rose, then ceased abruptly. Whatever moved below was not loose debris. The knocks had occurred at regular intervals, traveling from the lighthouse side toward the keeper's room. She marked their sequence and time on her plan before darkness erased the details. The following morning, she visited Penrooth's parish office. The clerk, Mr. Bastian, regarded a woman requesting property records as though Clara had asked to inspect the church silver. He eventually produced a rate book and a brittle map dated 1839, but only after she paid 1 shilling for access. On the map, Bellwether Head was divided by a red boundary line. The Wycliffe estate surrounded the lighthouse land on 3 sides, yet a narrow strip connected the cottage to the causeway and continued down the cliff toward a cove. Beside it appeared 2 faded letters. W.C. What do they signify? Clara asked. Watercourse, perhaps. There is no stream on the headland. Then the surveyor was mistaken. Clara copied the boundary before he could reclaim the map. Surveyors made errors, but they rarely drew water flowing uphill. At the general shop, she spent another 3 shillings and 9 pence on screws, linseed oil, a pry bar, and enough glass to repair 1 window. Mr. Curnow refused credit and mentioned, with studied carelessness, that Sir Alistair's steward had asked whether Clara was purchasing building materials. By the time she returned, Pike was waiting at the cottage. A notice had been nailed to her door. Sir Alistair contests your use of the northern path, he said. It crosses Wycliffe land. Clara unfolded her copy of the parish map. The registered boundary includes the path and the strip descending to the cove. That map is obsolete. Then you will have a newer survey. Pike's gaze settled on the page. You are trespassing whenever you pass beyond the cottage garden. I crossed no garden boundary when I examined my own wall. You would be wise to accept the purchase offer before legal costs consume what little you possess. He removed the notice, only after Clara insisted that any claim be delivered through a solicitor. As he pulled the nail free, she noticed pale grit lodged in the tread of his boots, the same hard, gray-white material visible beneath the combed surface of the sealed arch. Pike followed her eyes and stepped back. After he left, Clara chipped a fragment from the arch's mortar. The outer layer had been stained to resemble age, but the interior was dense and scarcely weathered. It was not original work. Someone had sealed the opening within recent years and disguised the repair. She needed to know where it led, but breaking through alone could collapse the stones above it. Instead, Clara investigated from inside. The corroded screws around the brass grill yielded after several hours of oiling, tapping, and patient pressure. Behind it ran a narrow copper duct, descending at an angle through the wall. The passage was too small for a hand, but wide enough to carry air and sound. She held a strip of paper before the opening. Near low tide, the paper remained still. As the sea rose, it fluttered inward. Nell arrived with her grandmother, Mrs. Miriam Tressa, a broad-shouldered woman whose gray hair had been twisted into a severe knot. "You have been asking about my husband," Mrs. Tressa said. "Only about his work." Men from Wycliffe Hall asked too. 12 years ago, after Jacob fell from the south gallery. Was he killed? He lived 3 days. Mrs. Tressa looked toward the wall. Before he died, he said the head had begun breathing again. I thought fever had taken his sense. Clara showed her the copper duct. Mrs. Tressa's face tightened. Jacob polished that grill every month, though he never told me why. On foggy nights, he would put his ear to it before lighting the lamp. The lighthouse had a fog bell? Not after the old frame broke. Sir Alistair said replacing it cost too much. Clara thought of the measured knocks beneath the floor. With Mrs. Tressa's permission, she hired Nell's older brother, Thomas, for 1 shilling and 6 pence to help clear the eastern room and lift damaged boards. Paying him reduced Clara's remaining money to less than £4, but the work exposed the joists safely. Under the raised keeper's floor, they found not earth, but a sloping stone channel. A cast-iron rod ran through its center toward the lighthouse. Green corrosion covered it, except where repeated movement had rubbed one narrow band clean. Thomas stared at it. That thing still moves. At the next rising tide, the rod shifted. Once, twice. On the 5th movement, something clicked inside the impossible wall. A concealed panel no wider than a book opened beside the copper duct. Within it lay a tarnished brass lever and a small ivory plate engraved with 4 words: for fog, draw and hold. Clara stopped Thomas before he touched the lever. The ivory plate gave an instruction, not an assurance of safety. The cast-iron rod beneath the floor still moved with the tide, and any machinery hidden beyond the wall had been neglected for years. A seized gear or fractured chain could turn stored force into flying metal. They spent the afternoon exposing another 6 feet of the stone channel. The rod passed through 2 iron guides, then entered the wall beneath the brass lever. Clara found no spring under tension, but a counterweight hung inside the narrow cavity, suspended by a corroded chain. This was maintained from somewhere, she said. No mechanic would build a chain he could not replace. Her plan showed where the access should be, not beside the grill, but behind the tall wooden molding at the room's northwest corner. The molding appeared decorative, though no matching piece existed elsewhere. Thomas worked the pry bar beneath it. The wood lifted without breaking, revealing a vertical line of countersunk screws. Clara cleaned each slot, soaked them with oil, and removed them one by one. The plaster section loosened inward. Behind it was a door. It stood barely 5 feet high and had been faced with lath and paper until it became indistinguishable from the wall. A recessed iron ring opened the door onto a passage filled with cold, metallic air. Thomas raised the lamp. "I'll go first. It is my wall. It is my lamp." They compromised by entering side by side. The passage widened into a chamber between the cottage and the lighthouse foundation. Curved granite formed one side. Brickwork formed the other. Copper pipes climbed the walls, converging above a waist-high iron cylinder. Beneath it, a piston connected to the rod under the floor. The chamber was not a hiding place. It was a machine room. At high tide, seawater entering the lower channel drove the piston inward. The motion compressed air inside the cylinder. A second pipe carried that pressure upward toward the lighthouse gallery. Clara traced the system with her fingers, careful not to disturb the fittings. The sea powered it. Powered what? The fog signal, I think. A thick pipe ended at a bolted flange above their heads. Whatever instrument had once been attached there was gone. 4 bright scratches around the bolts showed that it had been removed long after the surrounding metal had tarnished. On the opposite wall, shelves held oil cans, lengths of decayed leather packing, and a set of specialized spanners. Empty gaps in the dust showed where several rectangular objects had once rested. "Logbooks," Thomas suggested. "Or drawings. Someone had taken them but left the heavy machinery behind, perhaps believing it useless without the missing signal instrument." Clara returned to the lever. A chain ran from its base to a valve on the compression cylinder. Drawing it would open the air passage and release pressure into the upper pipe. She inspected the cylinder seams, checked the rod guides, and wrapped the weakest joint with layers of oiled cloth. Only then did she ask Thomas to stand outside the chamber. As the tide rose, the rod advanced. The piston groaned. Air whispered through the copper pipes. Clara drew the lever and held it. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then a deep note rolled through the cottage. It was lower than a bell and roughened by years of corrosion, yet it carried into the stone with extraordinary force. The floor trembled beneath Clara's boots. Outside, gulls erupted from the cliff. She released the lever. Thomas returned, pale and grinning. Penroof heard that. So did Wycliffe Hall. The sound proved that part of the system remained connected to an instrument above, although the main fitting in the chamber was empty. Clara examined the pipe again and found a narrower branch rising within the lighthouse wall. Its valve bore an oval maker's plate covered with verdigris. She cleaned it with oil and soft cloth until stamped letters emerged. E. Mercer Bellwether Pneumatic Works, 1841. Mercer had been her mother's maiden name. Clara remembered her grandmother only as a small, stern woman who smelled of lavender and machine oil. Eliza Mercer had died when Clara was 6. No one had ever said she owned pneumatic works or designed machinery. According to Roland, she had been an eccentric widow, fortunate enough to possess a coastal cottage. Thomas pointed to the lower edge of the plate. "There's more." Someone had struck the brass repeatedly with a chisel, destroying a line beneath the date. Only fragments remained. Pat. Then a gouged space. Then the letters WYC. A patent reference, perhaps, or a name someone had tried to remove. Clara searched the chamber more carefully. Behind the empty shelves, she found pencil marks on the brick, pressure readings, tide heights, and abbreviated dates. Most had faded beyond recognition. One notation remained clear. Its figures were drawn in the narrow, right slanting hand Clara had copied beside for 11 years. The numeral 7 carried the same unnecessary crossbar. The capital B had a shortened lower curve. Her father had written on that hidden wall. Beside a pressure measurement, Edmund Bellamy had left a date from only 4 months earlier, and one unfinished warning. "Pike has found the lower inlet. Do not let him." The The sentence ended where the pencil had broken. Clara searched the floor beneath the writing, but found only brick dust and a rusted washer. Her father had entered the chamber 4 months earlier, while illness supposedly confined him to Bellamy House. He had known about Gideon Pike, the lower inlet, and Eliza Mercer's machine, yet he had died without telling Clara any of it. A horse approached outside. Thomas extinguished the lamp. Through the grill, Clara heard Pike enter the keeper's room without knocking. "I know you are in there," he said. Clara stepped out through the concealed door. Pike looked past her at the machinery. For the first time, his calm deserted him. "You have interfered with a navigational structure." "I repaired nothing and removed nothing. You sounded a signal visible on no maritime schedule. A vessel might mistake it for a warning. The lighthouse has been abandoned for 12 years. That does not grant you authority to operate it." Thomas emerged behind her. Pike's expression sharpened. "Your father leases his cottage from Sir Alistair, does he not?" Thomas went still. "He came at my request," Clara said. "Then you accept responsibility for his trespass?" "He did not trespass. This chamber lies inside my property. That boundary is disputed." Pike departed with a promise that the magistrate would hear of the unauthorized signal. Thomas tried to continue working, but his hands had begun to shake. His father's fishing income had failed after an injury. Losing the Wycliffe cottage would leave 6 people without shelter. Clara paid Thomas the full day's wage and told him not to return until she could protect him. "You cannot finish alone," he said. "No, but your family should not pay for my inheritance." By evening, word had spread through Penrith that the new owner of Bellwether Head had sounded a false fog warning. Mr. Curnow refused to sell Clara additional coal. 2 fishermen accused her of tempting ships toward the rocks. Only Mrs. Tressa came to the cottage, carrying a bundle of Jacob's old clothing and anger enough for both of them. Pike frightened the village the same way when Jacob questioned the missing logbooks, she said. "Did Jacob ever mention a lower inlet?" Mrs. Tressa shook her head, but Nell, listening near the door, spoke quietly. "There's an iron gate below the cove path. Grandfather took me once. He said never go there when the black rock was covered." Clara found the cove on the parish map. The narrow strip marked WC descended directly to it. She waited for the next morning's low tide and set out alone. The path wound through gorse before dropping between wet granite walls. At the bottom, an iron grating guarded a tunnel cut into the cliff. Water trickled through it even with the sea 50 yards away. Recent tool marks scored the lock. Clara knelt to sketch the inlet and discovered a second channel branching beneath the path. Its stone cover had been shifted, leaving a gap wide enough for a child's arm. A pebble struck the rock behind her. Nell stood halfway down the path. "I told you to remain with your grandmother. You didn't tell me anything." The sea had begun returning across the flats. Clara ordered Nell uphill, but a metallic groan came from beneath them. The displaced channel cover tilted under the girl's boot. Nell fell waist-deep into the opening. Clara seized her wrists before she disappeared. The channel below was already filling. Each incoming surge struck Nell's legs and dragged her farther beneath the stone. Beside the opening lay an iron box exposed by the shifted cover. Its lid bore the same oval maker's mark as Eliza Mercer's valve. Clara could reach the box with one hand, but only by releasing one of Nell's wrists. Another surge came. Clara abandoned the box. She braced both feet against the channel edge and pulled until pain tore through her right palm. Nell emerged sobbing, one stocking shredded and blood running from her shin. The next wave flooded the opening. The iron box lifted, struck the stone once, and vanished into the tunnel. Clara half-carried Nell up the path before the tide covered the black rock. At Mrs. Tressa's cottage, she cleaned the wound and learned it would require stitching. The village surgeon demanded 5 shillings before he opened his case. Clara paid him. She also accepted responsibility when Pike arrived with the parish constable. Nell had followed without permission, but Clara would not let Pike accuse the child of trespass or theft. "I took her to the inlet," Clara said. Nell stared at her, understanding the lie. Pike handed Clara a magistrate's order, prohibiting her from entering the cove, operating the mechanism, or altering any disputed structure until ownership could be reviewed. Violating it could cost more money than she possessed. As he turned away, Clara noticed fresh gray-white mortar on his coat sleeve. That evening, with her palm bandaged and her remaining funds reduced to £2 11 shillings, she returned to the machine chamber. Someone had entered while she was at the cove. Eliza Mercer's maker's plate had been cut from the valve. The valve showed bright saw marks where the brass plate had been removed. Clara searched the chamber, the keeper's room, and the ground outside, though she knew the thief had not discarded it nearby. Her drawing preserved the inscription, but a copied name was not proof. Pike could claim she had invented it. Worse, the chamber floor was wet. Water seeped between the lower stones in thin, shining lines. The tide was falling, yet the level inside continued to rise. Clara examined the piston channel and realized the rod had stopped halfway through its return stroke. The system had jammed. She opened the small inspection valve. Air escaped, but the piston did not move. Whatever Pike had altered at the lower inlet was trapping water behind it. Clara could not reach the cove without violating the magistrate's order. She also could not leave the mechanism under pressure. For 2 days, she petitioned for permission to inspect her own watercourse. The parish clerk sent her to the magistrate's secretary, who required a written statement. The secretary sent the statement to Sir Alistair for response. Pike replied that no watercourse existed and that Clara's interference had created the danger she described. Meanwhile, water climbed another inch inside the chamber. Mrs. Tressa brought food. Nell, pale from her injury, admitted that she had seen Pike near the cove before Clara arrived that morning. "Would you say so before the magistrate?" Clara asked. Mrs. Tressa gripped the table. One truthful sentence from Nell might expose Pike, but it would also reveal that the girl knew the restricted path and had visited it before. Clara answered her own question. No, not yet. On the third afternoon, Thomas came despite Pike's warning. Together he and Clara tried to draw the piston backward with a rope passed around the rod. It shifted less than an inch before the rope snapped. Thomas studied the darkening water. Spring tide tonight. Clara had marked it in her notebook. The highest tide of the month would enter shortly after midnight. She sent Thomas home. "You cannot keep dismissing everyone who helps you." "I can, when the floor may collapse beneath them." Clara moved her father's portfolio, the parish map, and her survey notes into the eastern room. She packed clothing into a trunk and placed it near the door. Then she opened every safe valve she could identify. At 11, the hidden rod began to knock. The first impact shook dust from the chamber ceiling. The second bent one of the iron guides. Water burst through the masonry around the channel and spread across the floor. Clara pulled the fog lever, hoping the open-air pipe would relieve pressure. A broken, thunderous note sounded above the cottage. It continued after she released the handle. The lever had jammed too. The note rolled across Penroof while water surged beneath Clara's boots. She drove the pry bar against the valve linkage, but her injured palm could not hold it. On the next piston stroke, a copper joint ruptured. Air and black water struck her shoulder, throwing her against the wall. Clara crawled into the keeper's room. The raised floor buckled behind her. One board split upward, and seawater erupted through the gap. She reached the eastern room as the cottage lurched. The temporary brace she had built groaned beneath the ceiling joist. A crack raced through the plaster above her bed. She dragged the portfolio and trunk outside, then returned for the parish map. A section of ceiling collapsed across the table. Clara escaped through dust and rain, with the map clutched beneath her coat. Behind her, the eastern window shattered. The fog note died in a final metallic bellow. Lamps appeared on the village road. Men arrived carrying ropes and lanterns. but Pike reached the causeway with the constable before anyone entered the cottage. "You operated the mechanism in direct violation of the order," he said. "I opened a valve to prevent the building from bursting. After you activated an apparatus you did not understand." That accusation contained enough truth to wound. By dawn, the parish surveyor had inspected the exterior and declared the cottage unsafe for habitation. Clara was forbidden to re-enter without supervision. Pike produced a petition authorizing the Wycliffe estate to dismantle any machinery threatening the adjoining Lighthouse foundation. The hearing was set for the following week. The dismantling could begin in 48 hours. Clara stood beside her salvage trunk, while red notices were fixed across her door. Everything she had made habitable was flooded or broken. Her tools remained beneath the collapsed ceiling. The hidden chamber, her father's warning, and Eliza Mercer's surviving mechanism were now legally beyond her reach. Mrs. Tressa took Clara into her home. From the attic window that evening, Clara could see Bellwether Head against the sunset. A wagon stood beside the cottage. Men were unloading hammers, chain, and timber braces bearing the Wycliffe estate mark. Then Nell touched Clara's sleeve and placed a wet object on the table. It was a rusted iron key. "I found it caught in my torn stocking after you pulled me from the channel," she said. "It has the same letters as the box that washed away." Stamped into the key's bow were 3 characters, EM2. Clara turned the key beneath the attic lamp. The number troubled her more than the initials. A key marked 2 implied a first lock, and perhaps a second chamber. At dawn, she requested supervised entry to retrieve her remaining possessions. The parish surveyor allowed her 20 minutes inside the cottage, provided Pike and the constable accompanied her. Broken plaster covered the eastern room. Clara recovered her boxwood rule and measuring compass, then asked to inspect the machine chamber for personal papers. "No papers remain there," Pike said too quickly. The surveyor permitted 5 minutes. Water had receded from the chamber, leaving black silt across the floor. One copper pipe had split, and the piston rod was bent, but the curved lighthouse foundation remained intact. Clara measured the chamber. Her original plan allowed a wedge-shaped void nearly 2 feet deep beyond its western brick wall. The chamber they had found did not occupy all the missing space. She examined the empty shelves. Their supporting brackets were fixed to a tall iron backplate with no visible purpose. Near its base, beneath a skin of rust, she found a keyhole. The EM key entered smoothly. Pike seized her wrist. "That fixture belongs to Sir Alistair." The constable ordered him to release her. Clara turned the key. The iron backplate opened on concealed hinges, revealing a second narrow chamber built within the dry core of the lighthouse foundation. Copper-lined shelves protected 6 cylindrical document cases, a wooden model, and a leather folio wrapped in waxed cloth. Pike lunged forward, but the parish surveyor blocked him. "These objects remain undisturbed until they are inventoried," he said. "They are Wycliffe property." Clara lifted one document case. Engraved on its lid were the words, "Property of Eliza Mercer." The inventory took 3 hours. Inside the cases were engineering drawings, correspondence, maintenance records, and duplicate legal instruments bearing seals from the county registrar and Trinity House. Together they revealed a history no Bellamy had ever told Clara. In 1838, Eliza Mercer, then a widowed instrument maker, had designed a tidal compression system capable of sounding a fog signal without steam, coal, or a keeper's continuous labor. The same mechanism could drive a pump during ordinary tides. She proposed using its surplus power to lift fresh water from an inland spring across the headland into a public cistern at Penrith. Sir Alistair's father, Baronet Hugh Wycliffe, had financed the prototype. He later filed a patent naming himself as principal inventor, and Eliza merely as a witness. Eliza had fought him. Her folio contained the original dated drawings, invoices for parts purchased through her workshop, and letters from 2 engineers describing demonstrations they had attended before Wycliffe's patent application. One engineer had signed a sworn statement acknowledging Eliza as the designer, but Eliza had accepted a private settlement rather than face a trial she could not afford. In return for her silence, Hugh Wycliffe conveyed Bellwether Cottage, the tidal inlet, the cove path, and the machinery to her outright. A separate covenant required the Wycliffe estate to preserve access to the watercourse and fund the fog signal's maintenance from harbor rents. The covenant had no expiration date. A second deed placed any future income from the pumping system into a trust for Lighthouse families and Penrooth's water supply. Eliza had hidden duplicate records in the chamber because she believed Wycliffe would destroy the originals. The material value was not treasure in coins. The cove and its access road formed the only practical landing point for a railway company planning a coastal freight route. Letters in the most recent case showed that Sir Alistair had been negotiating to sell that access for more than £8,000. He could not complete the sale while Eliza's covenant and Clara's title survived. The final papers belonged to Edmund Bellamy. Clara's father had discovered Eliza's correspondence after her mother's death. He had begun comparing it with parish maps and Wycliffe accounts. 4 months ago, Jacob Tressa's missing maintenance notes led him to the hidden chamber. Edmund's last letter was addressed to Clara, but never sent. He wrote that he had delayed telling her because he wanted proof strong enough to withstand Roland and the Wycliffes. He regretted teaching her to measure buildings while failing to show her the full measure of the women from whom her ability came. At the bottom, his handwriting weakened. The cottage is yours, not because it is all they were willing to leave you, but because you are the one person Eliza would have trusted to finish her work. Clara read the sentence twice, then folded the letter along its old crease. The intellectual legacy lay around her. Eliza's complete designs, including an improved pressure regulator that had never been built. The legal legacy rested in the sealed deeds. The practical legacy waited beneath the broken floor, damaged but repairable. If restored, the mechanism could sound the fog warning and pump spring water to the village, as Eliza intended. Pike backed toward the door. The surveyor held out his hand. "You will surrender the maker's plate removed from this chamber." "I removed nothing." "No," Clara said, looking at the fresh saw marks and then at his tool case. "But you brought the same fine-toothed brass saw today." The constable opened the case. Eliza Mercer's plate lay beneath a folded cloth. Pike's public composure finally broke. He shoved the constable aside and fled toward the causeway, carrying the leather folio containing the original covenant. The constable pursued Pike into the rain. Clara followed as far as the cottage door, but her injured hand and bruised shoulder slowed her. Pike had already reached the causeway when Nell shouted from the cliff path, "The Black Rock is covered." Pike ignored her. He had spent years controlling access to Bellwether Head, yet he had never learned the tide as Jacob Tressa had. Halfway across, seawater swept over the stones and struck him above the knees. He dropped the folio, caught it by one strap, and staggered toward the far side. Thomas and 2 fishermen approached from Penrooth. Rather than risk being surrounded, Pike turned back. The next surge knocked him down. The leather folio floated free. Nell ran toward the water, but Clara caught her by the shawl. Thomas entered from the safer village end with a rope around his waist. One fisherman hauled Pike upright, while the other recovered the folio from a pocket between the stones. By the time they reached land, 20 villagers had gathered. The man who had warned them against Clara was brought back soaked, bleeding, and under arrest, while Eliza Mercer's covenant was carried above the water in Thomas Tressa's hands. The dismantling order was suspended that afternoon. A week later, the magistrate's hearing moved from his private chamber to the Penrooth Assembly Hall because too many residents wished to attend. Sir Alistair sat at the front with 2 solicitors. Roland Bellamy occupied a bench behind him, his face gray with anger. Clara brought no dramatic treasure. She brought measurements. Her enlarged plan showed the cottage, lighthouse foundation, hidden chambers, watercourse, cove path, and tidal inlet. The dimensions matched the 1839 parish map and the boundaries described in Eliza's sealed deed. The county registrar confirmed that the seals and entry numbers corresponded to records in his office, including a duplicate conveyance no Wycliffe solicitor had disclosed. The physical evidence supported the paper chain. Eliza's name appeared on the recovered maker's plate, the pressure valve, the model, and invoices predating Hugh Wycliffe's patent. Her drawings contained construction measurements identical to those inside the machine chamber, including an error in the first piston housing that had been corrected in the surviving apparatus. Clara explained each point plainly. Her training allowed her to show not merely that the papers were old, but that their author had designed the machine that still stood inside the wall. Mrs. Tressa testified that Jacob had maintained the mechanism and that Wycliffe men removed his logbooks after his death. A search of Pike's estate office had recovered those books in a locked cabinet. They recorded repeated orders from Pike to block the lower inlet, conceal the maker's plate, and deny repairs to the fog signal. Nell was not required to testify. Pike's own records did it for her. His habit of documenting every instruction to protect himself from Sir Alistair proved his undoing. The magistrate read aloud an entry authorizing payment for aged coloring of new cement at the bellwether arch. Another directed that the inlet cover be displaced before the spring tide, creating the pressure failure later blamed on Clara. Sir Alistair denied knowledge of sabotage. Pike responded by producing letters bearing his employer's signature. Their alliance ended in accusations. The magistrate referred Pike for prosecution on charges arising from theft, damage, and interference with the watercourse. Sir Alistair faced a separate civil action for violating the covenant and concealing registered burdens during railway negotiations. The proposed sale of the cove access was halted. Then Clara's father's papers were examined. Edmund Bellamy's accounts showed no debt of £340. Roland had combined household expenses he had authorized with interest never agreed upon. More damaging was a letter from Sir Alistair promising Roland £50 if Clara signed away Bellwether Cottage before inspecting it. Roland stood abruptly. A private family arrangement has no bearing on this hearing. It has bearing on attempted fraud, the magistrate replied. Clara watched her uncle shrink beneath the gaze of neighbors and strangers. She had imagined this moment during sleepless nights. Roland exposed, silenced, made to feel as powerless as he had made her. When it arrived, she felt no triumph, only distance. The magistrate confirmed Clara's title to the cottage, machinery, watercourse, cove path, and inlet. He ordered the Wycliffe estate to fund emergency stabilization under the maintenance covenant, pending a full accounting of decades of neglected payments. Roland's claim against Clara was dismissed and forwarded for investigation. Outside the hall, villagers surrounded her. Some apologized. Others spoke eagerly of jobs, railway money, and compensation. Mr. Curnow remained near his shop and offered no apology at all. A railway representative approached with a revised offer. The company would pay Clara £9,000 for the cove and access strip. With that sum, she could leave Bellwether Head forever. Clara looked toward the cliff. The cottage roof sagged, the eastern room was broken, and Eliza's machine lay clogged with silt. Restoring it would require engineers, masons, months of labor, and more money than Clara currently possessed. Thomas waited beside his mother and Nell. "What will you do?" he asked. Clara folded the railway offer and placed it inside her portfolio. "First," she said, "we make the head breathe safely again." Clara did not sell the cove. Instead, she negotiated a 99-year lease, granting the railway limited access along the southern edge of the property. The company paid an initial premium of £1,200, annual rent, and the cost of building a retaining wall that protected both the track and Eliza's watercourse. The covenant preserved public passage to the shore and prohibited blasting within 200 yards of the lighthouse foundation. The agreement gave Clara money without surrendering the land. Work began in April. The Wycliffe estate, under court supervision, paid for emergency masonry, a new eastern roof, and repair of the tidal inlet. Clara used part of the railway premium for materials beyond the covenant's requirements. She hired 2 Penroof masons, a carpenter from Falmouth, and an engineer who agreed to work from Eliza's drawings rather than replace the mechanism with a modern steam plant. Restoration took 9 months. The machine chamber had to be drained and cleaned by hand. Every copper joint was tested. The bent rod was removed in sections and reforged. The damaged cylinder required a new lining, while the pressure regulator was built from Eliza's improved design. Clara supervised each measurement. She made mistakes. One set of valve fittings arrived half an inch too large because she had copied an exterior diameter as an interior one. Correcting the order cost £6 and delayed the work by 11 days. When winter damp ruined newly applied plaster in the keeper's room, she stopped blaming herself long enough to redesign the ventilation. The cottage recovered slowly, honestly, without disguising its age. Thomas became Clara's foreman after demonstrating an instinct for machinery that no village apprenticeship had recognized. She paid him a weekly wage and arranged lessons in mechanical drawing. Nell attended those lessons too, though Mr. Curnow declared that teaching engineering to a girl was a waste of good paper. Mrs. Tressa responded by buying all her household supplies elsewhere. The legal reckoning continued while the repairs advanced. Pike was convicted on charges connected to the theft and deliberate damage. Sir Alistair avoided criminal judgment for the actions he denied authorizing, but the civil settlement stripped away that convenient distinction. He paid the accumulated maintenance arrears, surrendered Jacob Tressa's records, and issued a public acknowledgement that Eliza Mercer, not Hugh Wycliffe, had designed the bellwether system. Roland repaid Clara's seized savings and withdrew every claim against Edmund's estate. His solicitor sent 2 letters requesting that the matter be settled quietly. Clara preserved both letters with the accounts. She did not answer them. By early spring, the tidal piston moved through its full stroke. The restored fog signal sounded across Bellwether Bay during a supervised test, deep and steady rather than broken and violent. Fishermen in the assembly yard removed their caps when the note reached the village. The second half of Eliza's design required more work. A spring rose on higher Wycliffe ground, east of the headland. The old covenant granted the system access to it, but the connecting pipe had been cut decades earlier. Clara used part of the civil settlement to replace the pipe and construct a covered cistern above Penroof. At ordinary tides, the mechanism now pumped fresh water while storing pressure for the fog signal. 3 public taps opened in the village that summer. Families who had carried water from shallow, unreliable wells could fill their buckets without payment. Clara established the Mercer Trust exactly as Eliza's deed required. Railway rent funded maintenance of the pump, aid for injured lighthouse and fishing families, and 2 apprenticeships each year. Bellwether Pneumatic Works reopened in the repaired eastern room. Clara and Thomas produced improved regulators for harbor authorities along the coast. The income was modest at first, but steady orders followed the successful winter trials. Clara registered her improvements in her own name and placed Eliza's original design beside them, giving credit where it had been denied. The impossible wall remained. Clara repaired its hidden door, but did not conceal it again. She restored the blue-striped paper around the brass grill, leaving the grill uncovered so visitors could feel the machine drawing breath with the tide. Her father's drafting compass occupied the center of her work table. Edmund's unfinished warning was framed nearby, not as the final word of a frightened man, but as one link in a chain Clara had completed. 2 years after the funeral, the lighthouse lantern shone again under a new coastal agreement. Clara stood on the gallery with Nell as evening fog gathered over the water. Below them, the cottage windows glowed gold. The new roof held firm, and workers were finishing their supper in the courtyard. A vessel answered the light with a distant whistle. Far beneath Clara's boots, the incoming tide entered Eliza's channel. The piston advanced, fresh water climbed toward Penroof, and stored air moved through the copper pipes. The wall beside the old keeper's room gave one measured knock. Then Bellwether Head raised its restored voice across the dark sea, guiding strangers toward a shore that finally remembered who had built its safety.